Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Joseph Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and Don K. Price, Professor of Government. Professor Nye was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1994 to 95, Chairman of the National Intelligence Council from 93 to 94, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science and Technology, Department of State, 77 to 79. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including Understanding International Conflict, An Introduction to Theory and History, Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power, Power and Interdependence, World Politics and Transition, and most recently he co-edited Why People Don't Trust Government. Professor Nye, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Tell us a little about your background. What accounts for your focus on the study and practice of government and state power?
Well, I didn't intend to go into this. I had been at Oxford as a student on a scholarship, and I came back to Harvard to do some graduate work. I thought I might go into the State Department. I'd become interested in international things, and in the process of doing my thesis, which I actually did in Africa, I got a letter from Harvard saying, "Would you like to start teaching here?" And I said, "Well, I'll try it for a little while," and the little while stretched out. But then in the Carter administration, I was asked to take a political appointment, and I did that in the State Department, and then again in the Clinton administration. I did it both in the intelligence community and in the Defense Department. So it turns out that I spent 5 years of my adult life in federal service, though I had originally intended to spend more.
Going back to these earlier years, what books most influenced you?
Well, as an undergraduate at Princeton, I had been very powerfully influenced by Schumpeter's Capitalism and Socialism and Democracy. I was fascinated by the interplay between politics and economics, and when I was at Oxford, I read a degree called Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, which sort of followed the same sort of thing. So I've been intrigued by the interplay of politics and economics for quite some time.
And in Schumpeter's case, it was really about how institutions adapt to the great technological innovations?
Schumpeter was known both for his work on the effect of technology innovations, but even more so, he had a theory that capitalism was killing itself by its successes, and that democracy and capitalism couldn't coexist. He didn't like this, but he thought this was the way the world was working out. And he made a very strong case for it, though I didn't necessarily agree with it. But it was a case that at least planted firmly in my mind this question of how democracy and capitalism, or politics and economics, work with each other and against each other.
As you began your academic research, and then let's look at a minute at the body of your work. Really, it's been a focus on problems of the state and power in the context of global interdependence, and then in the context of globalization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes people will look at where I've worked and think that I can't keep a job or can't keep a focus. I seem to find a thread. I did my thesis in East Africa on the East African Common Market. And the key question was, could Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda hold together a common market which would be good for them economically, or would the political pressures of the newly independent African countries tear them apart? My thesis predicted they'd be torn apart. Alas, proved to be correct, though too bad for the countries. I then discovered that the Central American Common Market was working. So I went to Central America and lived in Guatemala and did a study of the Central American Common Market. From that, I did a study in Europe of the UN Conference on Trade and Development and also the European Common Market. And that got me interested in trade in difficult materials, particularly nuclear materials. And that then led to the job I had in the State Department, which was dealing with slowing the spread of nuclear weapons. That got me interested in the larger question of weapons, war, and nuclear issues. And that then led to the topic of what was going to happen to American power. Was there going to be a decline of American power, which many people believed at the end of the 80s? I said no, the declinists were wrong. And then I went back into government, and I had been very much interested in that study of the changing power relations about Japan. And when I was in government, I was able to work on Japan and also the rise of China, the problems of East Asia. But then the puzzle of what was happening to government more generally. Why was it that people were losing confidence in government? How was government going to need to change as we went through an information revolution? Led me to the current focus that I have, which is on this relationship between government institutions and the change in the nature of the economy and society that's occurring in an information age. It sounds like a lot of wandering around. I think there's a thread there, but perhaps the only thread is my own intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, but it does sound like a one step following another, as you stated. Is there a dichotomy between your theoretical work and your policy work? What I have in mind here is that in Power and Interdependence, this was a real effort to see how the realist model of international relations helped us understand and explain what was actually happening as we got increasing interdependence. Is the modality there different than in the body of policy work, which you've done a lot of?
Well, it's interesting. When I first went into government in the 70s, it was a little bit like being thrown into a swimming pool and told to swim. It's a totally different world in government from academics. In academic life, there's no premium on time. The premium is on getting it just right. In government, if you haven't got the right answer by 4 o'clock this afternoon when the president meets with the prime minister, that perfect paper you get in a little bit late is an F. And similarly, academic colleagues would send me papers that they'd written saying, here's the answer to the proliferation problem. And they'd be 30 or 40 pages with footnotes. They didn't realize that I was getting the office at 7 a.m., having to read the overnight intelligence, a briefing of the daily press, a couple of memos for testimony on the Hill later in the day, and meet with the Secretary of State at 7:30. The idea that I would have time to read a 30-page paper, just, I used to write them, and I found that I couldn't read them. So there's a totally different world between high-level policy positions and academic thinking. And my problem is I like both. I mean, I like action, but I also like the chance to be reflective. And so I've sort of been torn back and forth between the two. But certainly what's true is that when you're in a policy position, you wind up using up the intellectual capital that you've accumulated when you were outside. And it's outside that you're able to rebuild or build up your intellectual capital.
And how has theory informed your policy work?
Well, I found that in the book Power and Interdependence that Bob Keohane and I wrote just before I first went into government, we had talked about the areas where realism based on threats of force and security as the dominant issue were dominant, or was the most useful theory, and other areas where international relations becoming more complex. We called it complex interdependence, where there are more transnational actors. And it was intriguing that when I was in the State Department to find examples of each. Dealing with the nuclear issues, I found that sometimes when we were trying to persuade France not to sell a reprocessing plant to Pakistan, or to deal with the relationship between Pakistan and India and damp down any potential nuclear arms race between them and so forth, the realist theories were extremely helpful there. But there are other instances, for example, when we were trying to change the policy in the Clinton administration in the Carter administration on the use of plutonium and reprocessing, where there were suddenly transnational aspects which were very powerful. The so-called nuclear priesthood or nuclear mafia, the group of people who deeply believed that reprocessing the use of plutonium was the future of the world, had more in common with each other than they did with their fellow co-nationals. So there were transnational alliances made between, say, departments of energy and science and technology against state departments and defense departments. So there were odd coalitions that were formed which weren't caught by the simple realist model.
We should explain to the audience that in complex interdependency, the emphasis on different kinds of actors in relations between states, where there may be no fixed priority in military terms, and the use of force may not happen, basically. Right.
Yeah, basically the realist assumption is that security is the dominant concern, force is the major instrument, and that governments more or less maintain their coherence as they interact with each other. And in complex interdependence, essentially, security is less dominant as a concern, force is less useful as an instrument. You have many transnational actors that are going to and fro across borders, making coalitions that aren't always well described by national labels. And so when I went into government, I was quite fascinated to find evidence that these things that I'd written about actually existed and were influencing me and the policies that I was trying to deal with.
So in a way, in terms of the theoretical debate in international relations, which is your field, when you went out into the real world, you found it useful to have feet in both ponds, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think one cannot understand the world or deal with the world if one has simply a realist or a liberal view. The world is mixed of both. When I was later in the Clinton administration in the Defense Department dealing with policy in East Asia, I found realist theory very useful. We were looking ahead toward the balance of power in East Asia as you saw the rise of Chinese power, and you could argue that there would be three major powers in the region, U.S., China, and Japan, and that when you have a three-part balance of power, it's better to be part of the two than the one, and therefore reaffirming the U.S.-Japan relationship so that China couldn't play off U.S. against Japan, and then from that position of strength to jointly engage China and offer them a position as a responsible actor. That was pretty much based on realist theory.
Let's talk specifically about your experience in the Carter administration. You were in the State Department, and was your main focus proliferation?
Yes, I was chairman of the National Security Council committee that dealt with non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, though I was a State Department official, I had the job of interagency coordination on that issue, which was one of the major initiatives that Jimmy Carter had in the international area. And it was a very exciting time. The Americans were arguing that using plutonium, which is a weapons-usable material, as a fuel for reactors was a bad idea because it was likely to leak out, and that selling the facilities to make plutonium or enriched uranium, which is another bomb-making material, was a very bad idea. So we worked out guidelines for nuclear suppliers to restrict the sales of such things. We tried to stop or slow down exports that were going on at the time, tried to reconstruct or restructure the way people thought about this. But at the beginning, that was quite unpopular. Now people are more willing to accept those ideas. And in the late 70s, after the oil crisis, there were a lot of people who thought that these nuclear fuels, particularly the breeder reactor using plutonium, were going to save the world. We thought not. I think we've turned out to be closer to the mark on it, but it was wildly unpopular in some circles at the time.
Were you a better position because of your academic training in this area and the networks that you had in the academy with regard to this issue, or was that not relevant?
There was a study that I participated in on nuclear energy, or I think it was called Nuclear Policy Issues and Choices, that had been commissioned by the Ford Foundation, which had a number of people looking at the nuclear issue, and I learned a lot from that, and also also many of the people on that study wound up in the government. People like Harold Brown, who was part of the study, became the Secretary of Defense, and Spurgeon Keeney, who was the chairman of it, became the Deputy Director of the Arms Control Agency, and so forth. So those contacts developed, and the theory about what was going on, what needed to go on in that area, which had been developed as part of this commission while I was an academic, were indeed central to what I did when I was in the government.
What were the surprises for you of being an academic who had worked in an area and suddenly being in a position like this?
Well, there were things, you might draw an analogy to reading a movie script and saying, well, I know that story. And then when you actually see the film, you said, oh, I didn't know that shot was filmed at twilight, or I didn't know that this was going to happen so rapidly. So it was the different tempo, the different setting that suddenly occurred. I can remember times when you'd say, well, now if we do a careful study of this, here's how we should go about it. And the next thing you know, the foreign minister of another country has come in and made a statement which throws things totally off the plans that you've made. So this problem of how do you take chaotic reality and try to shape the right questions even before you get answers is very different in the government setting than in the academic setting. Because in the academic setting you have there's a luxury, there's no time limit. You can sort of sort your way through it, figure it out. If you don't have the answer, you go back to the library and look up more data and so forth. In government, you either solve it and get the right answer quickly, or it doesn't happen at all. And it's quite a different set of skills. I mean, it's the difference in the premium we put on time makes a huge difference.
But do any of your experience as an educator pay off? Because you are trying to reformulate questions, presumably getting people to think differently, and has working with students prepared you to do it with colleagues in the government?
Well, I think the ability to persuade other people that you have a picture of the future which is plausible and that this is a way in which you can move is an important source of power, and just the extent to which you can use your academic ideas to help shape that picture, it helps. The other thing is that being able to communicate orally makes a difference. There's the incidence of what's called the elevator briefing. I mean, quite literally, I remember in Korea having worked out a solution to a problem, but then getting in the ground floor elevator with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and having to explain to them this solution before we reached the top floor of the building, which was only about 7 or 8 floors. And if I hadn't been able to say, here are the 3 key points and here are the basic reasons, but I'll tell you the rest later, it wouldn't have worked.
Were your theories about complex interdependence and the new tools in this changing environment, did they prove to be applicable, your insights with regard to negotiations on proliferation? Yes,
in fact, one of the things that I found was that making transnational alliances was crucially important. In the proliferation area, I remember in the early part of the Carter administration, when Carter announced the policy that we had devised, it was widely attacked by a conference, an international conference in Persepolis, Iran. And it looked as though this was all the countries of the world condemning the new American policy. When you realized that the people who were meeting at this conference were essentially nuclear engineers and people who had known each other for years and who had worked together and who were teaming up with some American nuclear engineers to make it look like it was an international statement. It was actually a statement of the nuclear priesthood and not at all an international statement.
Looking back at that period, is there one accomplishment of yours? I know that you've, both times that you've gone to government, you've won Distinguished Service Awards, but in the proliferation area, can you identify one place where a theory, an idea you brought mattered in a program that emerged?
Well, I think the design, but even more the implementation of Carter's nonproliferation policy rested very heavily on some of the theories that I'd worked out about transnational alliances and also about the role of international institutions, of how could we use the International Atomic Energy Agency and how did we develop a new study group, which we called the International Nuclear Fuel Cycle Evaluation, as a way to buy time to get people to rethink how they approach this problem. Also the establishment of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which controlled the exports. Those things, I think, rested very heavily on the work that I had done on transnational coalitions and on institutions before going into government.
In your diary, if you kept a diary, was there a moment where something happened where you said the theory was wrong? How did policy inform your theory and maybe force you to adapt it?
Well, I guess probably the clearest example of that was when I was on the transition group that was working on policies for the incoming administration. This was for Carter. For Carter,
yeah.
And so it'd be December '76, just before the administration took office. I looked at the deal where France had sold a reprocessing plant to Pakistan and Germany had sold one to Brazil. And I said that if we tried to take these on too quickly or too frontally, we would arouse nationalistic reactions and it would be counterproductive. Therefore, we should follow an indirect way of going about it. And that was a great policy paper, theoretically informed by theories of nationalism. And the next thing that happened was the Germans sent a high-level delegation quietly to visit with the Carter people before they'd actually taken office. And that delegation was misinterpreted by the people they called on, and word came out that the Germans were playing hardball and we would respond in kind, and that we would send the Vice President Mondale, around to Germany and to Brazil to stop this. And that response was exactly the opposite of what I'd written in the paper, but it didn't matter. I mean, events overtook the theory very rapidly. Then you have to say, okay, given that that's where we are, what do we do from here? You can't say, sorry, my theory says we shouldn't do it this way. Right. You say, that's where we are, and now what do we do? And government has a lot of that.
There's a continuing debate in political philosophy and political science about the relation of power to truth, even in literature and so on. What is your fix on that? I mean, is there a point at which, if you're in politics, it constrains, it limits the truth that you hope is embedded in theory?
Well, there's a problem when you're in government. You often can't speak as frankly about some things publicly as you might want. When I handled press briefings in the Pentagon press room, and somebody asked a question that was loaded with dynamite, we were instructed never lie, but you didn't necessarily have to be like a moth flying into a flame either. I mean, you could sort of sidestep the question or avoid it. In academic life, that's not a problem. I mean, it's often the things that are hard to answer that are the most interesting because they make you look at new things. But when you're speaking as a government official, when you do great damage to a policy or a possible solution to a difficult problem by raising the wrong issue at the wrong time, you then often have to speak somewhat indirectly or sidestep things. And that's not always comfortable for an academic. And one of the nice things about academic life is that you can deal with these head on. For example, when I was dealing with non-proliferation policy in the Carter period, people from less developed countries would often say, you have nuclear weapons and you're trying to stop us having nuclear weapons. How can you justify that morally? Well, I couldn't stand in front of a major meeting on nonproliferation and say, gee, good point, maybe we shouldn't try to stop you having the bomb. But I tucked it away in the back of my mind and said, you know, when I get back to university, I'm going to try to think that through and answer that question. And the result of that is when I went back to Harvard, I taught a course on ethics and foreign policy and used that interaction with my students to work out my thinking. And then I wrote a book which was published in the mid-'80s called Nuclear Ethics, in which I dealt with those questions which had been gnawing at me as a government official, but in which I had neither the time to reflect on them properly nor the position to speak the open way in which I like to speak about them.
So a conversation really between the policy world and the theoretic world, actually through your constant redefinition of the problems you want to focus on.
No, yes, I found that this is something that, if you want a dialogue of theory and practice, has been something that I've been fortunate enough to experience. Before I went into the Carter administration, as I said, I'd been intrigued with this whole question of what was going to happen with nuclear commerce and the spread of nuclear materials. And then I had the opportunity to work on that in a policy position. And then after coming out of the government, I could think through some of the ethical questions. And similarly, when I went into the Clinton administration, I had been working before that on the questions of the rise of Japan, the role of China, the balance of power in East Asia. I'd written on that. And then I had the opportunity when I was in the Defense Department to take the lead on reaffirming the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, which was then beginning to atrophy. So I've been fortunate in the sense of being able to use thoughts I've developed in academic life, have a chance to apply them in government, and then come back and think of them again with another dimension or another fix on them in academic life.
I noticed in looking at your books and articles, the edited volumes, that it's often been the case that you've been a key figure in mobilizing a discussion on a topical issue. For example, you've edited volumes on Japan, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, and so on. Do those academic efforts feed back, do you think, in the policy process, actually?
I think so. A couple of the books, such as the ones you mentioned, were undertaken when I was directing a group we called the Aspen Strategy Group, which had about 30 members who included academics and former government officials, plus some people from the Congress. So that, for example, when the Aspen Strategy Group involved Brent Scowcroft, Les Aspen, Bill Perry, Jim Woolsey, John Deutsch. These were people who wound up in government positions, but who spent the time before that talking to each other, thinking through some of these problems. So the ideas that were in the books were also put directly into the minds of people who then wound up in policy positions. So you can think of academic ideas affecting government policies by what you might call a trickle-down effect. In other words, you write something and maybe somebody reads it who then distills it for a student who then becomes powerful, or you can think of the more direct effect. You write an op-ed piece in the New York Times and maybe it gets summarized for the Secretary of State or something. But the most powerful way is when you develop ideas with people who then actually go in and have their hands on the lever, or you get your own hands on the lever, and then the ideas are directly related to power.
Let's look at one debate, and that was the discussion in the United States, very intense in the early '80s, about the decline of American power, which led you to write Bound to Lead, the changing nature of American power. That was quite an intense debate, and today it seems gone with the wind, so to speak.
No, it's fascinating how much Americans can switch in their concerns and attitudes, but in the late 80s, majority of Americans believed that the United States was a declining power and that we were going to be overtaken by first Russia, then Japan and Germany. There was a book that was written by the very good Yale historian Paul Kennedy called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which was published in '87, I think, and which would have been a fine history book. It is a fine history book, but I was persuaded to write a chapter or two at the end showing that the Americans were going to decline just like every other great empire, unlike the British. And that actually got him great sales, but I think
bestseller.
It made a bestseller out of it, but it also, I think, made a poor argument. And I found this unconvincing in that I thought the analogy between Britain and America was incorrect, that the Americans weren't going to go through the same thing the British did in the same way. And so I wrote this book, Bound to Lead, in 1989, saying that given detailed reasons why the analogy was mistaken to Britain and why the American power was different and why it was likely to continue, both in the what I called hard power, your military and economic strength, but also what I called soft power, the cultural and ideological appeal of the country. And in the decade that's passed, I think that argument has held up pretty well, though I would admit that Paul got more of the royalties than I did.
Let's talk about your second job in Washington, which was in the Clinton administration. You were Assistant Secretary. Assistant Secretary of Defense. What was your focus there?
Well, I was responsible for the Defense Department's relations with other countries in the world, and so it involved a great deal of travel, but also we planned security strategies for all the major regions of the world. So we did U.S. security strategy for Europe, for East Asia, for Africa, Latin America, and so forth. And then in that context, I spent a good deal of time trying to work through the implementation of the U.S.-Japan security treaty and figuring out how to relate that to the rise in the power of China. So I spent a fair amount of effort on that problem as well.
We'll talk about that in a minute. I guess serving in the Carter administration and the Clinton administration, it's like you were dealing with a different planet in the sense that the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union was less of a problem than it had been before, and so on. I guess what this leads me to ask about is America's changing role in the world and how you were able to shape that view in this role, based upon the insights that you had developed as a political scientist.
Well, certainly during the Carter period, the worries about Soviet power, and obviously in the Reagan period, were dominant. They gave a clear focus to American foreign policy, sometimes an over-focus. And the problem in the Clinton administration, at least in the early years, was figuring out what the focus should be. And many people thought that the answer was that economics had replaced politics, and as the cliche went, that geoeconomics had now replaced geopolitics. So that if you look at the administration's early policy toward Asia, it was all focused on that, trade wars with Japan, rather than looking at the longer-term question of the rise of Chinese power, the role of Japan in that security equation, and so forth. So I think in a way, it was easier in some times for American foreign policy in the Cold War years because there was a North Star, and by the time Clinton came along, the North Star had been blocked by clouds.
So in today's world, what do you think America's role should be?
Well, I think the Americans, as the largest power, have to remain involved without falling into the trap of becoming the world's policeman and being over-involved. And I think what that means is that there are certain key things that we need to do, because if we don't do them, no one else will, and if nobody does them, it'll be a much more chaotic world. One of them is to maintain the overall balance of power. That means that American military power remains very important to stability in Europe, in Asia, in an area like the Persian Gulf, where we still are dependent on oil supplies. And therefore, the primary or first thing that America has to do is make sure that we have a stable balance. And that's why we have 100,000 troops in Europe, 100,000 in Asia, about 20,000 in the Gulf. Essentially is because it's a stabilizing factor, and we benefit from that stability. The second thing we need to do is to help preserve an open international economy, so that you do have benefits that can flow from international economic transactions. There are lots of problems with this. It creates friction at home. It can create a number of difficulties. But I do believe that in the long run, a liberal international economic trading system is better than one which becomes closed and protectionist. And I think that's an important role. And a third thing I think the Americans need to do is act as the organizer of coalitions of the willing of countries that can deal with serious issues, as we did in the Gulf War. And I think we need to, in that same context, provide support for international institutions. People complain about UN peacekeeping, but when you do something through the UN, it means 70% of the costs are being provided by others. It also means there's a legitimization of what we're doing. So we need to be the, sometimes people have used the organizer of the posse or the supporter of the institutions by which countries can pull together to accomplish certain common purposes. And then finally, I think we need to be the peacemaker and the country that tries to mediate the difficult conflicts, whether it be Northern Ireland or the Middle East or South Asia, because that, again, is a role which, because of our size and power, we're able to do. So those are the international roles. I should add to that a fifth point, which is we need to still continue to act as a beacon at home. Our soft power, our appeal to other countries, depends very much on our maintaining an open, vibrant democracy and a successful economy at home. And that is sometimes people think, oh, well, that's domestic policy. It has nothing to do with foreign policy. I would argue that you can't make that distinction, that the ability of our ability to run a good society at home is central to our position abroad.
Let's talk a little about the American consensus. If we had a president who had the vision to undertake some of these tasks that you identified, what do you see as the problems of building a consensus that we should proceed in that way?
Well, one of the problems of building a consensus in the period after the Cold War is that there is not as clear and present a danger as we had with the Soviet Union. So each group in the United States will then try to press its favorite agenda or press its particular interest. And it's very difficult in a democracy, as we are, to resist that. The person who is best positioned to do that is the president, who has what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pump him. Mm-hmm. And he needs to use that position to articulate why there's a larger American interest rather than just the sum of a set of partial interests. And so I think the role of the president in trying to reinforce an idea of why we're following certain policies and get that vision across is essential. And it's a lot harder in a period when you don't have a single enemy than it was before.
Well, let's talk a little now about East Asia, which you focused on, and a policy that seeks to shape the emergence of China. Can it learn lessons from the strategy we adopted toward the Soviet Union during the Cold War?
Well, there are a number of people who think that we should follow a policy of containment toward China, similar to the policy of containment we followed toward the Soviet Union. I think that's a mistaken approach for several reasons. One is that the Soviet Union in the 1940s and China today are very different. The Soviet Union then was a communist country believing in expansionism under communist ideology. China today, the ideology is a facade. The thing that really holds the Chinese together is nationalism, not ideology. The other thing is that unlike the Soviet Union in the 1940s, China's neighbors today don't see it as a clear and present danger. We couldn't organize such a coalition for containment if we tried. The only country that can contain China is China if it becomes bullying. And that might be a policy to follow sometime in the future if China does behave that way, but it would be a great mistake now. And the reason is that, and this is the third reason why that policy would be mistaken and why we resisted it, is that we don't know what the future with China will be. If we predict failure, if we predict conflict, if we treat China as an enemy now, we're guaranteed an enemy. But in fact, there's at least as equal a chance or more that we can reach an arrangement with China where China will be a responsible power. If that's true, we'll be better off, China will be better off, and so will the other countries in East Asia. So what we tried to do in designing our policy was to say, let's make sure that we have a position of strength by re-cementing the U.S.-Japan security relationship, and let's offer China a place at the table, a chance to be a responsible power in the region. So the first thing we did essentially was to reaffirm the U.S.-Japan security relationship to make sure China couldn't play off Japan against the U.S. But the second thing we did was then to tell China that we were willing to work with them on friendly terms if they acted as a responsible power. And President Clinton said to President Jiang Zemin, we are not afraid of China as a strong power if China is a responsible power, and we will work with you on that.
Now, what effects on policy do issues like human rights then have? It's as if you're looking at a realist focus on these issues, but lo and behold, complex interdependency comes back to affect what you can do. Comment on that.
Human rights are always going to be an important part of American foreign policy. For one reason, the American people want a moralistic portion of their foreign policy. And for another, standing for human rights is part of that American beacon that I referred to early. But it's also true that if you have a human rights policy only, then you don't have a foreign policy. Foreign policy is trading off a series of objectives that the American people have: strategic, economic, social, moral. And if you just have one, then you don't have a foreign policy, you have a human rights policy. It's also not clear, for example, to follow the China case again, that just sanctioning China, cutting off trade and so forth, would really advance human rights. The interesting thing is that human rights probably flourish more when you have rapid economic development than when you have continuing poverty. And it's interesting to look at the case of Taiwan and South Korea, where the repressive regimes that they had could not sustain the same type of repression after per capita incomes passed about $5,000 and a serious middle class began to develop. So the last thing we want to do in pursuit of human rights, if we care about the rights, let's say, of Chinese, is to stop their economic growth. We want to increase their economic growth. We want to supplement it with the development of institutions. I mean, having social institutions which work transnationally, for example, the way the Ford Foundation works in China. We also want to have the development of the rule of law, finding ways in which we encourage them to develop legal structures and things that protect rights. These are the ways in which you really would have a serious strategy to advance human rights, and I think that's got to be a serious part of American foreign policy. That's quite different from the instant protest or the threat to cut off trade unless this or that person is released immediately, which actually sometimes is a useful device, but sometimes can be counterproductive.
The other opponents of the policy you were describing that were those who focused on the economic threat from East Asia and the threat posed by Japan. Why can't they pay for their own security and so on? What are your comments on dealing with that part of the debate as you were making policy?
Well, there was a fear in the early 90s that Japan was overtaking us economically, that Japanese were eating our lunch, they were going to destroy us economically. I must say that looks a little bit feeble today when one looks at the condition of the Japanese economy compared to the American economy. When I wrote Bound to Lead in '89, one of the things I pointed out was that the Americans actually had transformed much of our economy in the 1980s, that manufacturing productivity was rising in impressive ways, that there were areas like software and information technology in which we in fact were ahead of the Japanese. So I was less taken by the threat of the rising power of Japan surpassing us in the economic area than some others were. Japan will be, I believe, successful in many economic areas, and there's some economic frictions with Japan because of the way they run their economy, where we properly should remonstrate with them. But that's different from ignoring the total context of all the issues in U.S.-Japan relations and how they fit together in a long-term picture for East Asia in a strategic sense.
What impelled you to leave government service and go back to Harvard?
Well, I surprised myself on this because in January '95 I had run out of my 2-year leave from Harvard, and I had to either resign my tenure and stay in government or go back, and I resigned my tenure. Mm-hmm. Then after April '95, there was the Oklahoma City bombing, and it was right in the aftermath of that I was offered the deanship of the Kennedy School, and I thought hard about it for about a month, and I said, if I can have another 6 months in government to finish up this initiative which I'm working on, then maybe if I go back to the Kennedy School, I can use that as a platform to organize the multidisciplinary faculty to think about this larger question of what's happening in government and governance in an information age. Why is it there is such a loss of confidence in government? Why is it that in the aftermath of Oklahoma City there's such a confused debate? And the one thing you can't do in government is reflect on anything. Mm-hmm. You use intellectual capital you've already built. And so I was torn about this since I enjoyed my stay in government, but I feel in some way that the larger issues of what was happening to government were issues that I was very deeply concerned about, but had no time to think about when I was in government. And that's why I went back.
And the first efforts with regard to focusing on this problem have emerged, and that's your new book, which you are co-editor of, called Why People Don't Trust Government, the first of a series. In brief, why don't people trust government?
Well, we had a faculty study group that spent a year and a half wrestling with that, and the causes are several and they're quite complex, but the most interesting thing is to notice it's not just government. There's been a decline in confidence in institutions generally, and to some extent it reflects a demystification of authority, or it reflects a change in the balance between what you might call the libertarian versus the communitarian dimensions of our existence. Over long periods, there has been a greater focus on the individual and individual rights and liberty, and less focus on institutions and community. To give you an example, divorce. One side of divorce is that it increases the liberty for the individual. People aren't trapped in unhappy marriages, particularly women. That's good. The other side is it destroys an institution which is vital to a community, which is the family. two sides of the same coin. Whatever one thinks of it, over time, there has been a decline in respect for authority and trust in institutions, and government has been one of the parts that has suffered from this. But another part is another cause is the change in the media and the political process, which has become much more critical and negative and cynical, and not only toward government, but toward other institutions. So sometimes when people say, well, government isn't trusted because government's done such a bad job, but if you say, well, what about the practice of medicine, or what about universities? Are they also not trusted because they've done such a bad job? I think there's probably a broader cause than just government performance that's at stake here.
And the issue of the decline or the failure of productivity to continue to increase as it had in earlier periods, say in the 60s, and the failure of wages to grow has also been an issue in all of this.
Well, we expected that the economic cause would be one of the stronger. We looked at about 17 hypotheses in the book, and there is a dramatic change in the rate of growth of productivity and economic growth generally in the early 70s in all major countries. And we expected that would be a cause of the decline of trust in government. The thing that was quite interesting when we looked at the data, in particular details, was that if you'd done well in the economy and if you'd done poorly in the economy, you still had the same degree of mistrust of government. You would think if the economic hypothesis were the strong one, those who've done badly should be more mistrustful, and those who've done well, less mistrustful. But there's actually very little demographic distinction in the data.
Do you think that the governments will have to change in light of the way the information revolution is affecting us all?
Yes, this is the next phase of our project, is looking ahead on how government is going to need to change in an information age. Going back to Schumpeter, there's an argument that can be made that the technologies related to the first industrial revolution, steam applied to transportation and production, led to major changes in the economy and society, and eventually to government. You had urbanization, which led to police forces, sort of Robert Peel's bobbies. You had the rise of public education, the need to produce clerks for the new factories and mills. And the same thing happened in an analogous form at the end of the 19th and early 20th century with the rise of electricity and synthetics and the internal combustion engine. And I think the computer and communications revolution of our time is having an effect analogous to those other industrial revolutions. But we're just beginning to understand or to think through some of the effects that it'll have on government. Quite clearly, government in the 20th century has been centralized and bureaucratic. And I think the prospects that government will have to become less centralized, less bureaucratic, there'll be more complex relationships between governments and the private and the nonprofit sectors is more likely in an information age. But I think we're only at the early stages of trying to understand this.
What is the Kennedy School doing to prepare students for this uncertain future?
Well, we try to make sure that each of our graduates knows something about analytic methods, microeconomics and empirical methods, something about public management, how do you manage complex organizations when there's no clear bottom line, and something about what we call politics, advocacy, and leadership, the ability to move your agenda forward. And we think that our graduates, if they have this set of skills, will be better equipped as they move across different sectors, but with a continuing concern with public issues. And if we can put that in the larger context of a school where you have faculty from a dozen different disciplines taking the lead and thinking about how governance of democracies needs to adapt and change, we hope that we'll be able to prepare a set of leaders for the 21st century.
One final question, if we have students watching this and they're asking themselves, well, what lessons are to be learned from your life's work and this movement between the world of ideas and the world of policy and back again, what lessons would you suggest that they draw?
Well, perhaps the most important is how poorly I would have predicted what I wound up doing, and the importance of following your intellectual curiosity, and also of moving back and forth between thought and action and letting each sort of fertilize the other.
Professor Nye, thank you very much for sharing this hour with us and talking about your life and work. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.